Bonus alert. What's up, guys? I'm Zach Grauman. I was Andrew's campaign manager, now the co-host of our weekly podcast, Yang Speaks, and welcome back. Every once in a while, in between our Monday episodes, we're just going to throw in a bonus episode midweek. And this week, we've got the one and only Krystal Ball. Krystal Ball is just a badass. She's the host of the show Rising on YouTube, which you guys should check it out. She's also got a really fascinating background because she worked for MSNBC before this and has run for Congress in her own right. So Krystal and Andrew talk about a whole bunch of fascinating topics. They talk about the future of the progressive movement now that Joe Biden's our presumptive nominee. They also talk about what the heck it's like to run for Congress for the first time. But the most important thing they talk about is something I'm extremely passionate about: the Yang media blackout. So if you were following the 2020 race at all, you saw that Andrew Yang got the least amount of speaking time on every single debate stage, and he had some of the least mentions and coverage in the entire race. So with Krystal, her and Andrew go inside what we call the belly of the beast, what it was like working at MSNBC and what incentives are there. Why does a candidate like Andrew Yang get no coverage? So it's a fascinating conversation to learn how the world works, learn how mainstream media works. I hope you guys enjoy. So tune in now and also tune in on Monday when we're back at it. Thank you, guys.
Hello, everyone, and just want to welcome the incredible Krystal Ball to Yang Speaks. Krystal, yay! Let's give you a round of applause. Oh my gosh, I have known and admired Krystal from before the campaign really got going, where she was an advocate for universal basic income. And one of the first things I did was try and track down anyone who was an advocate for universal basic income before I ran, to be like, hey, I want to run for president on UBI, let's do this thing. So Krystal, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be on. Congrats. I'm very excited about this new venture and direction. And yet people don't realize, even before that, we had met when I was at MSNBC, and you were a guest on the cycle when you were with Venture for America, and we'd kind of kept in touch. So we are longtime friends here.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember really liking you, even from our MSNBC interview, just thinking like, wow, she really has her shit together. And then I saw your background too. You're like a trained CPA. You ran for Congress, and that alone must have been an incredible set of experiences, because I feel like for you, and at the time you were, I'm sure, one of the younger candidates.
Yeah, when I first started running, I was actually 27. It was the 2010. This is the year of the Tea Party. Great time to be running as a progressive in a rural Virginia district. But, it was one of these situations, which you could probably relate to. I mean, running for Congress is nothing like running for president. But in terms of sort of jumping in head first, I had never worked on a campaign. I had been political in the sense of like ordinary engaged citizen. And I think like a lot of people in this political moment, I had a kind of awakening then when I felt called to get more involved than I have ever conceived of before. And it was actually my husband, who you've also met, who was like, look at this guy who's representing your congressional district. This guy is lame. You'd be better than him. You should just run for Congress. Like, you care about these issues. And it's still a lot of the things that, that animates you, that animates me. The corruption that runs so much of our politics, the problem of money in politics, the way that's infected both parties. Like, those were the animating issues for me jumping off. And so he kept at it. And eventually it was like, what the hell? What's the worst thing that can happen? I run and I lose. Life goes on. And in fact, I did run and I did lose, and life did in fact go on.
All those three things happened.
Yeah. As I'm sure you may be discovering as we speak.
I too ran and lost, and life has continued. There's some lessons here, Krystal, we can impart to anyone who's considering running. You will still be alive the day after the race, even if you lose.
Well, and not just that, and to be serious for a moment, like, I think it's obvious to people watching what you accomplished in your campaign, and especially now where universal basic income is like on the tip of everyone's tongue. It's become a bipartisan advocacy for a sort of modified temporary universal basic income. But, when you started, we looked at the polls. To the extent that people even knew what that was, they were like, no.
Yeah,
and you moved
true.
the needle so much in your campaign, and not in a strictly partisan way. So it's not like just, oh, you ran and you lost and life goes on. It's like you ran and you lost, but that doesn't mean that you didn't accomplish anything. And in my own way too, with my campaign, obviously congressional campaign, much smaller scale in like an obscure rural district, very long odds. I got absolutely crushed, all those things. And yet what I wanted was the ability to raise the issues that I cared about, that I thought were important to the country. Like I wanted the platform and the voice to be able to do that. I didn't get that by becoming a member of Congress, but I did get it in a different sort of way. So, it's funny how sometimes you ask for a thing and you get it, just not nearly in the format that you expected.
Well, good for John encouraging you to run back then, being like, yeah, you'd be better than this person, which I'm sure you would have been. So can you describe what it was like to run for Congress as a 27-year-old newcomer to politics, a woman in rural Virginia?
It was very, very scary for me. And one of the things people might be surprised to learn, although actually I don't think it's that uncommon for media people, is I'm a sort of naturally more introverted person. And so to put myself out there like that.
You were a CPA. It means you just sit there with numbers for a long time. That's not exactly.
That appeals to me. Like being with a spreadsheet is an appealing thing to me rather than human beings. So, not only to put myself out there just in front of people, but also to have the courage to raise my hand and be like, I think I should be the one. Like, I think you should vote for me. I think I would be the person out of your available choices who would best represent that district. That was to me very, very scary. And I was a young mom at that point. I have 3. At that time I had 1. She's very little. She's just a toddler at the time. My oldest now, Ella. And I remember taking her to an event, a women's event in Virginia for Democratic women candidates. And the sign-up sheet, you're supposed to put down like normal sign-up sheet. This is funny how I remember all these details. This is how like painful it was for me. Your name. And if you were running for office, you're supposed to like check a box and write down what you were running for. And I was like paralyzed because it was so
U.S. Congress.
Yeah. And I was like, oh my God, like, do I put down U.S. Congress? Do I put down House of Representatives? What's the right thing that I should put down here where people aren't going to think I'm stupid and don't know what I'm doing? So I agonize over that. I get in the room. I'm sweating, nervous, and the child is misbehaving, which makes me feel even more awkward. I mean, she's just being a normal toddler, but, I'm just like stressed out about all this stuff. And then the time comes during their talk where they're like, raise your hand if you're running for office. And I literally didn't do it. I mean, this was one of the first events. This was an event for women running as Democrats for office. And I was too afraid in that moment to do it. But I kept going. I kept pushing. I found my voice. I found an enthusiastic base of support. It was a brutal year, Tea Party wave, all of that. I mean, seeing all of that up close and what has led to now was also just, incredibly formative. But ultimately, what I came to was realizing that I was so fixated on like me, my performance, how am I doing, what are people thinking of me, that this really wasn't actually about me. Yes, I'm the person on the ballot. Yes, all of that. But when I focused on the people in the room and what they needed and what they weren't getting, then suddenly that took a lot of the fear out of it, and it made it a lot easier. And I think it was also more successful ultimately and more impactful because of that focus.
Oh, that's tremendous, Krystal. I remember how awkward it was telling people I was running for president for a while, where they were like, president of, like your co-op board. And I was like, United States of America. So I remember all of these internal hurdles you have to overcome.
Yeah.
And then just saying it to someone and having a straight face and then have them receive it in a particular way. I'm sure for you, it was a real journey over a number of weeks and months where you'd say, I'm running to be your congressperson. And then over time, it would actually become natural and feel like you.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that it ever really felt 100% natural. And of course, you had your own like stereotypes that you were overcoming as an Asian American. I had stereotypes that I was overcoming. I had people tell me like the only thing you should be running for is after your children. And I'm not talking about these are Democrats
that's so awful.
who said stuff like that to me. But, you know, you sort of come to a place and a peace with it. And ultimately, you know, I feel that decision point for me, obviously, of deciding to step off the path that I was on, the CPA path, the spreadsheet path. Not that there's nothing wrong with that path. It's a good path. I don't want to like,
no, it's a good
but
path.
to step into public life in that way and say like, I'm planting my flag in the ground and I'm going to do what I can to try to lift my voice to these things that I think matter. That was obviously a real pivot point in my life and one that I'm, you know, tremendously proud of taking in spite of the fact that, you know, still today, like we were talking before we came on air, like people are being mean to me on Twitter and I'm still like, oh, it's hard, you know, but come on, like how hard are people's lives out there? If you're not willing to step out, get uncomfortable, take that incoming, then what are you actually willing to do?
Well, Krystal, there are a lot of people right now who are trying to make changes in their communities, and I feel like your journey is such like an awesome example for so many. Like if you had guidance for someone who's thinking some of the same thoughts you were thinking when you were 27 about trying to do something positive in their community, what they'd have to go through. Let's say it's a woman who like isn't necessarily going to get the kind of reception or support that you know you might hope for. Like what kind of guidance would you have for them?
You know, one of the things that has been a struggle for me, and I don't know that this is for everyone, but I think there's a lot of cultural programming in America for women to like be the good girl, right? You get a lot of praise for like doing the right thing and following the rules and deferring to others and sharing and playing nicely. Like those things are all reinforced continuously, you know, for little girls in particular coming up in America and probably even more so, you know, young girls of color. And so for me, it's stupid, but like one of the psychological barriers I've had to overcome is being willing to people, you know, to break some eggs for people to think that I'm divisive or controversial. Because if you're going to get anything done, if you are going to change the status quo, right? Saying every American should get $1,000 regardless of income, like done. That's a controversial thing. And there are going to be people who don't like you for it, who say mean things about you for it, who have a financial interest in keeping things the way that they are, who want to smear and dismiss you. And so if you have any sort of critique that is going to alter the status quo, you have to be prepared that you're not going to be the good girl. You're not going to get the gold star. You're not always going to get the pat on the head. But for the people whose lives you're changing, you will be a hero. And it's a small price to pay, ultimately. It's like a psychological price. It's really such a small price to have to bear. But for me, that's been something I've really had to check within myself, that desire to like pull back and say, oh, maybe I'm going too far, maybe I'm pushing too hard. And I suspect that that's the case in particular for a lot of women.
I bet you're right. Certainly, I had a note on my phone, just this is sort of a fun anecdote, where it just says, just remember that to the vast majority of Americans, you are the magical Asian man who wants to give everyone money. and like no matter what happened in terms of the campaign, I was like, whatever. Everyone's just going to think of you in that way anyway. So another sort of funny comparison is that I went to this Asian American in politics event early on in my race in DC, and absolutely no one like was clamoring to support the Andrew Yang campaign at that event. like early on, it wasn't like Andrew Yang is here. It was more like who, what is going on? And this is after I declared. So just that reminds me of like, you know, when you're talking about being in the room with the women who are running for office as a Democrat and not raising your hand. Like it's not easy.
Yeah. Well, do you mind, can I turn the tables a little bit? I mean, what was kind of like what was the toughest moment of your campaign? What was that low point where you had to reach for those sort of like, you know, the note that bolsters you or your family or whatever the things are that keep you whole and sane?
There were a lot of tough moments on the campaign. I think after the first debate was like a struggle because I didn't get much airtime, and there was a sense I'd let a lot of people down. And so so that point was like a gut check. There were other tough points around just being on the road a lot and being away from family for a while when things were not going well, and you're just like, what the fuck am I doing? Like, or early on in the campaign, we were scratching and clawing for every bit of resources. And I would call friends of mine and be like, hey, can you just donate $2,000 to my campaign? People that $2,000 is not that big a deal to. And they would not do it. Honestly, they would, or they would like, and like that stuff where just like, oh my gosh, man, like, we've been friends for years. Like this is not anything that should be that big a deal. Like, at least in my world, like if the situation was reversed, I think I'd do it without much thought, particularly if you called me. If you called me, then I'd be like, oh my gosh, you're calling me? Like, I really should have done this already. But like, people just wouldn't do it. Like that.
I had that and it surprises you because on the one hand, people you really think you're going to be able to count on are like, no, I'm not there for you. And then people who you're barely in touch with, right? Who have been like barely a part of your life. I mean, for me, I tell you very specifically, there's like this high school philosophy teacher. I took 1 year of philosophy with him in high school, and I never even would have thought to reach out to him to ask for me. And this is not a wealthy individual. And yet every time I sent out a fundraising solicitation, he would come in with like $500, and, those people show up as well. So it really, really reveals the sort of, I don't want to say the character because I don't want to make it like a character flaw issue, but it really shows you who's going to be there personally for you in your life.
Well, what I've said is that when you do something that's really important to you, whether it's start a business or run for office, you make some friends and you lose some friends.
Yeah.
Like, that's happened every single time for me. And, you just have to like try and shrug and move on. But there are some real like scars and like wounds where you're just like, wow, I thought that if there's anyone I could have counted on, it's you. And it turns out like that is not the case.
Yeah.
So there were certainly ups and downs to the campaign. But one of the things that we tried to be is we tried to be the positive, effusive campaign, because it seemed like politics generally was such a slog that, like if you could avoid the negativity, I thought that would be a massive advantage.
I think that really came through to people because while you had this sort of dire assessment of the state of America, you had this, one of my
Boy, was
critiques.
I wrong, huh, Krystal?
Yeah, everything's great. I don't know what you were talking about. Things are going perfect. No, one of my critiques of the Democratic Party that I think you share is that, there's a lot of contempt, frankly, that comes from some parts of the party towards some types of people in the country, especially, in rural areas or people who voted for Donald Trump. Like there's just, when I was living in Kentucky, a state that I really, really, really love and find interesting, that people are wonderful and, would be happy to make my home there again if given the chance. And their politics are very interesting. I would send out things that were going on in Kentucky, people losing health care, right to work, being passed, terrible for working people. And I would get back these messages that are like, well, screw them. They voted for Trump. And it's like, where did we, like, I didn't sign up to belong to a group of people who are going to pick and choose who they
deserves
have,
health care or something
right,
like that.
and who they have compassion for, right? I mean, there's the same group of people that rightly, in my view, would have lots of compassion for, people who are incarcerated, who like broke the law, who messed up, but they believe they deserve a second chance. I believe that too. But you're going to show them mercy and compassion, but for this other group, because you don't like the way they voted, or you think that they're not, evolved enough on different issues, you're going to just write them off and have complete contempt for an entire state based on that.
I'm 100% aligned.
Like, yeah, and that was one of the things that I really admired about your campaign is I felt like that message of, we've got some problems in this country, but in terms of the people, like just fundamental sort of respect and value of the people of the country, which doesn't sound like a radical notion, but I fear is a bit of a radical notion. I thought that was one of the most important and frankly most courageous parts of your campaign.
Well, thank you for characterizing it as courageous. It was just, to me, the common sense, straightforward, natural thing to do. But I remember being attacked as like a right winger when I retweeted a New York Times article about opiate death rates in predominantly rural white parts of the country. That it was literally a New York Times article about these death rates, and then people were like, "Oh, this is some kind of, like appeal to conservatives all right." I was like, why would an article about opiate death rates in rural white parts of the country somehow only matter to a certain segment of Americans? Like, that would matter to everyone in my mind. And so that there were some things that I frankly just learned through the process that would never have occurred to me.
Yeah. No, I remember in early days, there was this whole thing going on about how your support was all coming from white nationalists. And that was a whole theme of the early days. And look, you see that consistently with kind of, outside the establishment movements. There's an attempt to just like dismiss them as, those people are all, you don't want to be associated with those people. They're all white now. They're all have these problematic views, or whatever tactic is used to dismiss them. And they tried that very much with you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it was deliberate. It was very confusing though, from my perspective, because I was like, where did this come from? So you run for Congress, lose, and then MSNBC reaches out and says like, "Hey, do you want to come on air?" Like, what was that conversation?
Yeah. So, I mean, I assume you know this story, but I don't know if you know this story. So at the end of my campaign, there are these stupid party photos that are released on a right-wing blog in Virginia. And they're like, I'm of age, I'm fully clothed, but they're sort of, sexually provocative, right? And so this thing takes off like wildfire. And I've got this weird name, I'm young, like all of that stuff, right? I mean, it just all feeds into this stupid cable news feeding frenzy. And so this is a kind of an interesting part of it. Most of the advice I got from the sort of political consultant types was just don't say anything and hope it goes away. Right. Well, it was not going on. I mean, it was like the third most Googled person in the world. So stupid. And if you looked at the photos at this point, it's so mild in comparison to the politics that we have now. But anyway, so I decided to go on cable news and defend myself and say, like, look.
Good for you, Krystal.
Sexist bullshit. If it was a man, you wouldn't care. In fact, Scott Brown, I don't know if you remember this, had run that same cycle, and he had like posed nude, and the media narrative around that was, he's a beefcake, and this is like part of his appeal. But with me, I was like a hoe bag who shouldn't be trusted, right? So I went on, I defended myself. I called it on as a double standard, as a bunch of sexist bullshit, which it was. And the funny thing, and this comes back to like getting the thing that you want, just not in the package that you expected, was that very thing, which had been done to try to destroy me, actually gave me that platform. And so, I was a long shot congressional candidate who got her butt kicked. I would never have gotten any media attention but for that. And so after the election, some of the shows that had me on asked me to come back just to talk about, like, let's talk about women in the midterms. And then I did okay with that. And they're like, let's talk about, this political issue in general. And that just sort of snowballed. And I shout out to the two people in particular who put me on the most in those early days. I don't know if you remember or know Dylan Ratigan, who had been at CNBC and then MSNBC, and who was one of the, the people who really understood the financial collapse, somebody I still really like and trust. And then Megyn Kelly, who, of course, very independent-minded over at Fox. And so those were the two people who started having me on, and it just sort of snowballed from there. So it's funny how these things work out sometimes, Andrew.
Wow. So then when MSNBC offered the job, like that must have been a very big lifestyle shift for you, because at that, to that point, you'd been living in Virginia. Had one daughter. Had you had your second child at this point?
No, I had him while I was at MSNBC.
Yeah. So, I mean, that must have been a very big lifestyle switch. Did you commute or did you guys move to New York?
No, we moved to New York. And in fact, we moved to New York even before I got the show, when they just made me a contributor, which is like, you're like a fancy contributor at CNN, but I was like a low level, like, yeah, whatever, we may put you on the air if we feel like it, contributor at MSNBC. But we kind of decided to throw in with that path and see what happens. So we had already moved to New York. And yeah, it was like the most exciting thing I could imagine to have that show. And I got to work with some great co-hosts. I got to work with my executive producer, who had been actually Dylan Radigan's executive producer. But before that, he's like a cable news legend, frankly. He was the EP of the Today Show, executive producer of the Today Show. He hired Matt and Katie. He built that outdoor plaza. So he is still my like TV mentor. And it was just an incredible experience to get to work with him. And at the same time, you get a real education in just the sort of sausage making of the cable news world, which has been, I think, part of that inner understanding is part of what I've brought now to Rising, that I think a lot of our viewers respond to.
Yeah,
because
you
there aren't a
seem
lot
like
of
you're
people
the
who've been on the
counterpoint to
inside.
cable news very often.
Yeah, well, I mean, there aren't a lot of people who've kind of been on the inside but are willing to critique it, because it's hard. These, you get to know these people, who become your friends. You don't want to like be mean to them, but at the same time, there are obviously a lot of, as you know, blind spots and failures in coverage, and I would say in particular sort of class blind spots and blind spots for any anti-establishment candidate, desire to sort of minimize them and minimize their approach because of what it means for upsetting your access or the status quo that sort of gives you your station there. And so I think that perspective has been part of what people have responded to on Rising.
I agree, but I want to hear more about your time at MSNBC, because you were there for how many years?
I can't remember if it was, I think it was 5.
Oh, that's significant.
Yeah, 5 years.
So you were deep in. And how did what was like the peak of that relationship? And then how did it end?
It's such a funny story. So partly I wasn't necessarily exactly politically simpatico as the 2015, 2016 primary started to come into view. I did a monologue in early, I want to say it was 2014. It was before Hillary Clinton had even officially declared. And I did this monologue that was like, look, I have respect for Secretary Clinton and what she's accomplished and her intellect. But this is a terrible candidate right now. Like, she's so tied in with the establishment. She's so tied in with Wall Street, with these, she sat on the board of Walmart. She gave these speeches and made all this money. Like, please, Hillary, don't run. Because if you do, it's going to freeze the field. We're going to have very limited options, and you are the wrong candidate for the moment. And that has become obvious in retrospect. And frankly, a lot of that was obvious at the time, but nobody had really said it.
It was not that obvious at the time, and certainly it was not a popular opinion.
And no one had been willing to say it on like mainstream airwaves. So the Clinton folks did not appreciate that perspective. And they apparently, reached out to the president of the network. And then, look, I wasn't censored. Nobody told me I couldn't say what I wanted to say ever, right? But I was told that any of my future commentary about Hillary Clinton had to be, vetted by like the president of the network, had to sign off on it. And look, and this is part of understanding how this medium works. It's not that there's a directive that comes down and says you will support Hillary Clinton, but you're going to be subject, what's going to win you praise and what's going to like make your life more difficult, basically. And I'm a human being. I'm sure that I changed some of, how hard I went or how aggressive I was or how often I was willing to say it because I knew there was that added level of scrutiny. But ultimately, there was a new NBC News president, Andy Lack, who came in, And it's a funny backstory because you remember Brian Williams was in trouble. He'd lied about things and they were trying to figure out, they pulled him off the air, but here he is, this like quarterback player with a big, multi-million-dollar contract, and they're trying to figure out what to do. And so they basically bring in Andy Lack, who was an old friend of Brian Williams, to figure out what to do. And the decision was, we're going to clear out all of the opinion on daytime MSNBC, so that Brian can come in as like a breaking news anchor, but it would be uncomfortable for him to have to come in during like these opinion hours. So we're going to fill out the lineup with NBC News journalists. And this was like this brief moment before Trump got elected when, after Trump got elected, all of the opinion hours are what skyrocketed in the ratings. And so they sort of abandoned that direction. But at that time, the idea was we got to get rid of all these like people with opinions and put in the NBC News people. And so I was part of that culling where our show was canceled, Alex Wagner, Ronan Farrow, Joy Reid had a daytime show that she lost. Then she ultimately ends up on the weekends. Ed Schultz was let go in a similar time frame. There was just like a wholesale cleaning out to the point, and it really, I think, wasn't, personal, so to speak. I never really even met Andy Lack before that decision was made. But I think the fact that it was so impersonal made it harder for me to take, because it was like the good girl thing again. Like I did everything that you asked me to do.
You'd been there for almost 5 years,
I'd
I'd
been there. I'd been like the team player whenever they needed me to sell. I was there. Like I raised my hands for all that all the feedback I got was I was doing well, and the cycle had some of the best ratings among young viewers, which was supposed to be like an important metric, and all I felt like I did it all right, and I still got canceled. And that was a hard thing psychologically for me to deal with.
Yeah, it'd be hard for anyone. I mean, you're there for 5 years, you're putting your heart and soul into something, and then it gets axed.
Yeah. But again, like I'm grateful for that, because now with where I am at this point, first of all, I took the time after MSNBC to have another child, which obviously is a great blessing and gift that I'm very grateful for. But also, like, I have so much more freedom in what I do now. I'm so much more of a free person, frankly. And I wouldn't trade that for anything. I would never want to go back to that role that I had, even though it was so painful at the time to lose. So, I'm grateful to them, because I think it all worked out, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so I appreciate that moment in my life, even though it was kind of hard to take at the time.
Well, I would say so. I mean, you are off to the races now with the Rising and the entire the book, which I have directly behind me.
Nice.
Here it is. The Populist Guide to 2020 by Krystal and her co-host and co-author Sagar and Jetty. Did I get Sagar's last name right?
You nailed it. You nailed both of them.
Yes.
Good work.
So, yeah, I mean, you're now this unfettered, independent voice, and people really sense it and respond to it. I can't tell you how many times people would send me your monologues or video clips from your show. And I think what's wild is I feel like you're now this hybrid between and this is meant as a compliment, but just like as like a full-on independent voice, like podcaster and a media company. You're like this kind of hybrid where it feels like you're melding like a personal point of view with institutional weight.
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. And I don't know that there's anyone else who's quite in this lane. And my own theory in terms of sort of wielding power and leverage within the media, so if I think like an activist here, is the most powerful conversation is to have a combination of real grassroots following plus elite awareness. Right. And, this is partly the model of your campaign, too. Like you developed this grassroots following. It took forever for elite media to actually take you seriously at all. Bernie Sanders in 2016 had the same thing. Like the crowds were there, the enthusiasm. There was clearly like energy for this movement and these ideas. And it took forever for elite media to take it seriously. And to me, that melding when you can have some foot into the kind of elite world where they know that you're there, they're paying attention to what you're doing, you're having some ability to influence that conversation, plus a real grassroots following is like the magic formula. And I'm not saying that we've like achieved that, but that's kind of ultimately the goal. And, one of the things that this is just essentially an accident. I mean, some of these things were intentional and some of them we just sort of stumbled into. The fact that we have this very cable news looking set, right, which is different from most other YouTube programs. It's funny how those sort of visual indicators are really important to people, because if they have this more anti-establishment or populist viewpoint, it's not represented in mainstream. First of all, it's just very validating to them to see someone who at least looks mainstream having a similar perspective and like validating those ideas. But we've also had so many viewers tell us that what they love is that they can take our segments and send them to a brother, sister, mom, aunt, friend, whoever, who doesn't necessarily share their politics, who's mostly watching sort of mainstream news, and they won't reject it out of hand because it has the right look.
Yeah,
so
it looks familiar. It just looks like another show they don't watch. Yeah.
So they'll at least like listen to it with a more open mind because it looks like something that they have watched before. So like I said, that was sort of, I didn't see that in advance as being an important part of it, but it has ended up being a significant part of sort of the innovation of Rising, I think.
I like it. You're like a wolf in sheep's clothing. I like it. You just like throw that set on it. Then you can say whatever you want. So you just noted that MSNBC didn't exactly shine a spotlight on Bernie, during his campaign ahead of 2016. Do you have any perspective on that? Like, why does it seem like the folks in certain environments don't exactly embrace the opportunity to talk about the Bernies of the world?
I think there are a lot of reasons. And again, I don't think sometimes it is as blatant as like, you are not going to cover this person positively. Like sometimes it legitimately is that blatant, but mostly it's more these sort of incentive structures and blind spots that exist. I think one of the big blind spots that exists throughout the elite news media or legacy news media or whatever you want to call it has to do with class. Right? And this makes sense. These are mostly upper class people. They're mostly surrounded with other upper class people. At this point, there's so little local journalism that you don't have as many people coming from the scrappy beat in Scranton or wherever. There's just, for example, and I say this with love because I genuinely love all the co-hosts I had at The Cycle. When I started The Cycle, I was the only person on a 4 co-host who wasn't from Massachusetts, right? So there's a little bit of like a monoculture that creates some natural blind spots. So if you have a movement, whether it's Donald Trump's movement, where, he has a truly devoted white working class base that, people in news media they just didn't know or see these folks, so they were easy to ignore. Bernie Sanders has a disproportionately young and working class base. So there's just sort of a natural tendency to dismiss what you don't have personal experience with and don't personally understand. So I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is the way that political journalism works is you're very dependent for your promotions and your own sort of visibility and buzz and all of those things that come with that on access to, the politicians in this town. And so it becomes very uncomfortable to challenge or go against those politicians or to embrace someone who poses a threat to them, right? So Bernie Sanders, obviously, whatever you think of him, posed a threat to the sort of establishment of the Democratic Party in this town. That means all the consultants who depend on the gig flow. That means all of the cable news pundits whose contracts depend on access to that structure, right? That means donors who love to have their egos stroked with those phone calls and get to show up at the White House Christmas party and all that stuff, right? Bernie was legitimately a threat to that established order. And so it was uncomfortable for a lot of mainstream journalists who depended on access to that world to challenge that world and to have an open mind, I think, about the Sanders movement. And again, these things are like, I don't want to make it sound like it's some nefarious plot. These are natural human instincts, like in-group thinking and, the people you're surrounded with and the things that you're comfortable with. Like, all of that is very natural. But because you have this kind of monoculture within the news, it adds up to very skewed coverage when you're talking about candidates who don't fit their mold or who come from outside of the establishment.
To me, a natural move, if you were that organization, would just look up and say, okay, I guess we should try and hire someone with a different background, outlook, perspective, and make sure that we're covering like a set of issues or candidates or regions that we're not seeing right now. But it doesn't seem like many organizations really have that kind of process of soul searching. I haven't seen it.
Well, and that's where the bottom line comes into play, because ultimately most of these news outlets, the Times, the Post, MSNBC, CNN, most of their viewership is a sort of affluent white liberal viewership. So in a sense, these are capitalistic organizations. They are looking out for their own interests, their own bottom line. They have a consumer in mind. This is never explicitly stated, of course, but it's true. They have a particular customer that's going to buy New York Times subscriptions, that's going to sign up for the Washington Post, all that stuff. And so that's who they're going to cater to, mostly in cities, mostly white, mostly affluent, mostly liberal. And so that's also part of this whole package, is that there isn't really an incentive to bring in those other perspectives and try to play to other regions of the country, because that isn't the customer base that they're looking for, that their advertisers are expecting to want to reach.
Yeah, that makes sense, given that at this point, everything's just flowing towards the almighty dollar, and wherever the dollars are, wherever the advertising dollars are, that's where your organization's going to head. And you did something I really admired, which is you tried to elevate non-traditional candidates out in different parts of the country. You were the reason why I became a Richard Ojeda fanboy and supporter and became friends with Richard. We ended up hiring several people from his campaign staff in West Virginia. So if you want to talk about some of the work you've done to try and address the problems that you and I are describing right now.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to what we were saying about some elements of the Democratic Party having contempt for certain regions of the country, for working class people, in particular white working class people, as you very much discovered. And but I think there's so much class contempt in our society in general, so much looking down the nose, so much condescension towards working class people who we're discovering now more than ever. I mean, they're essential workers today, of course, but they're always essential workers. These are literally the people who make our country run. Like, we're completely dependent.
There are going to be a lot of people in urban locations right now that are going to absolutely freak out if there's a supply chain disruption out of Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, where if meatpacking workers and truck drivers decide not to do what they're supposed to do, we're going to find out just who's important very quickly. And there are people right now that are worried about that happening.
You are 1,000% correct. I don't know if you followed this Purdue chicken processing plant, I believe down in rural Georgia, and the workers were protesting because they weren't getting hazard pay. They didn't have safety protective equipment. And one of the workers was like, we are out here risking our lives for chicken. Right? And that's to me, so telling, and is also kind of a central theme of your campaign, just respecting people's humanity, treating their lives as more important than having the shelf fully stocked at all times with Purdue chicken nuggets. mean, it's really that basic. And so one of the things that I believe profoundly in is representation of working class people in the halls of power, not in like a focus group or in a poll or like,
Come on, Krystal. All we have to do is find out what magic words to say to them and then
that's
like
right,
check
exactly.
that box.
The messaging.
And then
We just got to change the
going.
brand. Right? Or like as human sort of props, but behind a politician who's speaking. No, I think working class people should have power, like be the ones holding power, because they are the ones, not just today, but always on the front lines in our economy. And just as representation matters for diverse communities, it matters that you have people who are our servers and our wait staff and our delivery workers and people working in warehouses, or like you mentioned, Richard Ojeda, who's a veteran who served our country. Like, it matters to have those people not just being pandered to, but actually having power. And I believed in my, I'm sort of becoming less hopeful about the Democratic Party at this point, if we're being honest. But I really think that one of the ways that the Democratic Party could bridge this divide that has been artificially inserted between the white working class and the black and brown working class is by having more voices that are themselves working class. And so you don't have that sort of cultural barrier of people like, I saw the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee supporting these like lobbyists who barely lived in the district, and they'd come back and they'd get a consultant to tell them how to talk to people in their own hometown. It's like, what are you doing? Why not find people who understand their community, who talk like their community, share, like aren't just viewing this as an outsider, they actually share in the struggles of that community. Like, why not try to elevate those individuals and see what happens in terms of how they wield power and who they ultimately represent? So Richard is a great example of that. JD Scholten, who is running again.
JD, yes. JD's going to win. Let's go, JD.
In Iowa, he's, just a great guy, right?
Great guy.
That's like the best.
I donated to JD just the other day. Just continue if there are other people like JD and Richard.
Yes, and by the way, and running against a particularly odious member of Congress, Steve King.
Yeah, Steve King's that guy who literally even the Republicans kicked him out of the committees because he got a little too blatantly racist.
Yeah, he's from Iowa, okay, which was not a part of the Confederacy, and he still had a Confederate flag on in his office. This is like what we're talking about. But so people like JD, there's another woman down in North Carolina I love named Dee Dee Adams. She got her start. She was a teamster working on a line in a factory. I think we need more of that in the Democratic Party in particular, and politics in general. You just don't have those voices represented. So that's something that I believe in and have tried to work on, try to highlight some of those folks.
Well, I was so confused where when I would meet people who are working class in different parts of the country, and when I said I was a Democrat, they were like, oh no. And I was like, man, you really hate Democrats around here. And I was like, aren't we supposed to be sticking up for you, the truck driver, you, the farmer, you, the waitress? Like what the heck has gone wrong for the Democratic Party where working class Americans don't think it's their party in a lot of the country? Like that to me is like the central theme that we seem to be missing.
It truly for me is heartbreaking, because I've always seen myself as a Democrat, and I've always believed that the Democratic Party was the party of the working class. But, this is frankly, it's been an intentional shift, right? And this started with Bill Clinton in the 90s. There was an intentional decision to orient the party more around sort of, white collar, affluent suburbanites. Not that there's anything wrong with those individuals, but that's a very different kind of politics, because you're talking about people economically who more or less benefit from the status quo. So they're not interested as much in putting sort of those, transformational economics at the center of their political agenda. And so that decision has translated over many years to where we are now, that, the Democratic Party year after year after year has become more centered around that demographic. The politics are more representative of their perspective. And then, for the Black and the brown working class, it's basically like, well, you can't vote for the Republicans because they're too racist, so you're stuck with us. And the Republicans do their own version of that, right? They've got like their affluent interests that they cater to. And then to the white working class, it's like, oh, well, those Democrats hate you. They have contempt for you, so you're stuck with us. And what happens when you divide the multiracial working class like that is you've ended up with two parties that basically represent affluent interests. And I'm not trying to say like they're both equivalent or there's no difference between the two.
No, it's true.
Of course. But if you look at this response on coronavirus, the economic response. I mean, every single senator voted to give $4 trillion, which is much more than the media typically reports, but they are leveraging the amount that was in the bill. The Federal Reserve is leveraging that to give $4 trillion in loans to big business. The small business fund that,
evaporated in days.
No, like that. And we knew it would. This was entirely predictable. Why is there even a cap on that fund? The amount to individuals, pathetic, and one-time payment. And you've got millions who are getting kicked out of their jobs, filing for unemployment. I mean, these are all choices that were made. None of this is inevitable. These are all choices that were made, and they are the byproduct of two parties that have the interests of the affluent first. And so I think, the results of that could not be more clear than outrageously in this moment. And with that small business, I mean, this just completely outrages me. And, I'm sure people and I know people as well who are
totally left out in the cold. They're like applying and getting no response.
And trying to keep their businesses afloat, trying to keep their employees employed, trying to be able to pay their rent, for their business, for their location. And because the implementation of this program, first of all, the dollar amount way too small. Why is there a cap at all? Second of all, the implementation is left to the banks who were just learning,
dumb.
gave concierge service to their biggest clients.
Any client of theirs just got the red carpet, and then if you didn't have a private banker, you were fucked.
That's exactly right. Had special concierge service and all the mom and pop small businesses got screwed. And so what are we going to see coming out of this crisis? Rather than, the kind of reinvigoration of small businesses, of local industry, of keeping wealth, locally in our communities. That was one possible outcome of this crisis. And instead, we're going to have the exact opposite.
Yes.
Amazons, the Walmarts, the Apples of the world, they're just going to get bigger and bigger. And I just was reading before we started talking, something like 100,000 shops, stores are likely to go under as a result of this. And again, that was a choice made in a bipartisan fashion by both of the parties here.
A lot of these jobs are not coming back. It's heartbreaking. I see the same things. And to me, the best course of action would be for the government just to be like, look, just send us the bill. Hey, landlords, don't charge your tenants. Send us the bill. Hey, businesses, you have rent. Send us the bill. We're just going to pay for it over this multi-month period of time, and then when it's time to reopen, then you can just come back. But until then, we got it. And you're right, what is the purpose even of a cap? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
When you're talking about trying to elevate people from different backgrounds into leadership, it reminded me of German companies that have board seats for people who are in the factory or the manufacturing plant. You literally have people with high school or the equivalent of high school educations, but they had a lot of technical, apprenticeships and training. But literally, from the shop floor, just sitting there in the boardroom, being like, "Hey, that's a bad idea. It's a good idea." And the decision making is going to be entirely different for the fact that those people are genuinely there, not just expressing that perspective, but pulling the lever.
Right.
That's the kind of thing we would need in our government wholesale.
Yes.
It's like you had people who actually just said, "Hey, guess what? My people are putting their lives on the line for fucking chicken nuggets, and they don't have adequate protection. They're getting paid chicken scratch, probably almost literally, and the rest of it. I mean, it's infuriating. It's heartbreaking. I'm grateful that at least we've moved the needle on this conversation, where it seems like there's going to be an openness and enthusiasm to universal basic income that they're Because to me, it's like tens of millions of Americans are going to get money in their bank accounts, and they're going to be like, well, that was great. And then when someone says, hey, you should probably do that all the time, then people will be like, that's probably an excellent idea. But you're right. Like, we've mishandled this in so many ways.
Well, and that is the thing is, I think part of the reluctance to do more is then you make people realize that you could do more, that all of the like, how will you pay for it was all bullshit, right?
All bullshit,
It was total crap. And like, oh, once you realize the government could be part of helping me secure my economic interests or, you know, providing health care, then you're not going to turn around and forget that that happened and be like, okay, I'll go back to working for $7.25 and killing myself and not having health insurance and still not being able to pay my rent even after the pandemic. You're going to say, oh, wait a second, government, you did this before. We could do this again in normal times. Let's go ahead and do that, right? Which is, I think, part of what, like, how come we're not having more of a conversation about healthcare during a pandemic? How come we're not covering coronavirus treatment during a pandemic? It's because if you do that, then people are going to say, well, wait a second. If you can cover my coronavirus treatment, how come you're going to let me like starve and die
of this other condition
because of cancer or because of any other illness? So I think that's part of the reluctance, frankly, to do more is because then people start to expect better.
I used to tell people on the trail, Krystal, the biggest lie in American life is that we don't have the money, that people are just going around and be like, oh, we're going broke, we're going bankrupt. It's like, are you kidding me? You know, when push came to shove, we found $4 trillion for the banks. We found $1.5 trillion for the big companies for stock buybacks. And Americans saw it very clearly just now. It's like when you needed it, 2.2 trillion or 2.8 trillion or 4 trillion was there. You know, like we can do much, much more for our people. But so many people have essentially been brainwashed to think that we're broke. And meanwhile, we're the wealthiest society in the history of the world. And you have $1 trillion company like Amazon paying zero in taxes while hiring another 100,000 people in the midst of a pandemic. You know, they did like the confusion is intentional. I mean, people have just been spreading these messages and hammering the fact that like, oh, these people are trying to pull one over on you. Meanwhile, like people's communities are disintegrating. How
quickly were they able to flip the switch and pour tons of money to support the financial system? Like that.
Hours, days.
That backstop was in place. But the backstop for average Americans, for small businesses, still haven't found it. I mean, they were able to mobilize to undergird and provide a safe, big fancy safety net for the financial system. But those mechanisms have not been designed and are not in place for average Americans. And it tells you where the true priorities lie. Moments like that really reveal where the true priorities lie and what this country is actually set up to do and who it serves.
Yes, it's socialism for the wealthy and well-connected, and rugged individualism for the average family that's out there trying to figure out how the heck to pay the rent.
That's it.
It is very dark. And I remain, you know, I'm a very positive guy. I mean, I guess you'd have to be positive to run for president out of total anonymity. The rest of it, I believe that illusions are dying as a result of this crisis, and that people will be hungry for a different, more dramatic set of solutions. I certainly hope that we're in position to be able to make those solutions real as quickly as possible, because the suffering is unimaginable.
Yeah, I hope that you're right. And I think that you are. I really genuinely do. I think the mask is coming off in a lot of ways in terms of our priorities and who this town ultimately serves. Am I allowed to turn the tables? Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure thing.
So how are you thinking about, you know, I was critical of how quickly you jumped on board with the Biden campaign and when you endorsed him and all of that. But I mean, I'm genuinely curious about like how you're thinking about a potential Biden administration. What are your best hopes and what are your concerns?
So I intended to stay neutral, but then it looked like Joe was going to be the nominee to like a 99% probability. At that point, I said, you know what, like we need to try and unify to beat Trump because he has like this massive head start, a resource advantage, the bully pulpit, and all these other things. So that was my thinking, and I get along well with Joe. Bernie was an inspiration for me. Like, you know, in my mind, to me, it was about trying to put ourselves in the best position to win. And I'm in a position where I think that any extra day of a Trump presidency is a disaster, and that it like 4 more years of this would genuinely be catastrophic. I mean, heck, we're living it now. My best hopes for a Biden administration is that we win, and then we start digging out and solving these problems in much bigger, more dramatic ways. And I personally think the entire, like, I'm a moderate, I'm a progressive, like, I think that stuff's going to go out the window in the same way that you saw things go out the window when Congress came together to pass the stimulus, where like, you know, if you were a fiscal conservative, you were still like, yep, 2.2 trillion, let's do it. You know, like I think that there's going to be a clarity of need and a practicality in our approach that's going to make it so that all things are on the table because people are dying. And it's not just people are dying directly of the virus. It'll be that people are dying on the streets in different ways, and we're going to have to become much, much more aggressive about trying to solve people's problems. That is what I think our best chances.
And so does it concern you? Because I see Joe Biden as having been part and parcel of getting us to the place we are now, where even, you know, before coronavirus, working people were so pushed up against the wall where, you know, 40% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency, where you're talking about $7.
I'm sure it's much higher now, yeah.
Right. I mean, like, all in the name of like efficiency and increasing GDP, jobs shipped overseas. Sure, go ahead with automation, displacing workers and not providing anything, you know, any support underneath. Obviously, like the disastrous war on drugs, that's something you've been incredibly courageous in calling out. And he was a prime architect of that. I mean, do those things concern you in terms of how he will actually govern? Because I think one of the things that you and I share, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I know you said this on the campaign trail, is that Trump is a symptom, right? He is a problem in and of himself, but he's also a symptom of a deep problem. And so that's my concern with a Biden administration, is like, he's actually
I read your essay in the Populist Guide to 2020. I remember
he's part of erecting the system that actually enabled a Trump to come to power. And frankly, I'm more fearful of what could come after a Donald Trump, as bad as Trump is. You know, he's like incompetent and bumbling, and he doesn't know what he wants, and he's like buffeted and he couldn't even get a question changed on the census. And that's not to undermine the real danger that he represents. But I'm more fearful about what do 4 more years of incrementalism and reinforcing the status quo that brought us Trump, like what comes after that?
I'm optimistic that no sane administration would be pursuing incrementalism when you have literally historic levels of unemployment, like the lowest proportion of Americans working in history, I believe. Like you'd have to be very, very misguided.
But they're pursuing incrementalism now. I mean, that's what the parties have teamed up to do in Washington right now, while 26 million people are filing for unemployment.
Now, I don't disagree with the fact that this response has been like a shit show, and that we need to do things differently. I think most people know, and I think most people also know that. Like, I disagree with Joe on many of the fronts you just described and others. Like, am I for universal health care as like a human right? Yeah. Like, we should have had that decades ago. The fact that it's tied to employment is absurd. So there are all of these things that I disagree with Joe on. But I'm personally confident that if we win, we're going to be more open-minded about the depths of the problems and what we need to do about it. Because at this point, the problems are laid bare for all to see. Now, that it could be that optimism is misplaced, but that's truly what I believe. Like, job 1, beat Trump. Job 2, dig deep and start working to solve these problems. If it turns out that I'm wrong and that we're just scratching the surface, then I'll probably run again and say like, well, fuck this. Like, I'm going to try and like get the real things going in another way. I mean, that's what I tried to do this time, but I came up short. And so then, you have to try and push forward in as positive and practical a way as you can. And I'm optimistic that we're going to be open to different measures than has historically been the case, because we're dealing with a generational crisis and everyone can see that.
I pray that you're right, Andrew, and I just don't see much sign in this town that is going to be the case. But I certainly pray that you're right. But you just made some news, I think. You're thinking you might run again if things don't go well?
I'm already on the record saying I'm going to run for office I'm going to run for office at some point. I mean, you can't not.
But you would think about running for president again?
Oh, yeah, I would. I mean, it's like I ran to solve the problems. The problems still exist. I'd actually have a much easier time with another run than this last run, because now, people have heard of me and like.
Yeah, well, and you know what to do. I mean, you just learn so much from the process too. Is there anything you would change in your approach?
Well, first I'd replace the Zach guy who's just like a real weight on the whole campaign.
Dead weight.
Good move, my friend.
Yeah.
Upgrade the staff, man.
One thing is, I would spend more time in DC trying to familiarize people with my vision for the country and have them engage with us intellectually. What you just said makes me sad, Krystal, where you said it's like, well, you're in that town and you don't see like that reckoning, that sense of, of a need for change. But one of the things I found in my campaign was that if I spent time with someone, they would often go from who the hell is this guy to like, oh, this person seems sincere, seems engaged with the issues, seems like they genuinely want to help. And there were many, many parts of the establishment that I did not have that opportunity with, that I think I can at least move a degree in the right direction if I invest the time. So that's one thing I would do differently. Before I was coming at it from the outsider lane because I was, like new on the scene and the rest of it. And I want to be still myself and true to the vision, while also trying to present to folks that like I'm a reasonable leader with the nation's interests at heart and a patriot. Like I'm not here to castigate or demonize anyone. I just want to try and move us forward because we're decades behind the curve. A lot of people are suffering and we need to fix it. And to me, this is not even just like us versus them. This is like just any kind of enlightened self-interest. It's like, look, if you're rolling around in your urban center, it has to be clearer to you than ever that your life, your very life, is dependent upon people risking their lives at every part of the supply chain to try and get you the chicken nuggets. like thinking that somehow if they get more, you're going to lose is total bullshit. Like I just need to open people's eyes.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear that. And I think you're right. Like optimism is the only choice, right? No matter how many dispiriting things I see coming across my desk every day here in this town. And, I think there are a lot of reasons to be discouraged if you believe in the values that you believe in. But there's no choice other than optimism. There's no choice other than believing that you can make that change, because the only other option is a complete, like, cynical nihilism where you just disengage.
Fuck this shit.
And frankly, I am very worried.
I get that stuff. I'm sympathetic
and I'm
to
worried that is going to be the decision of a lot of people, especially frankly young voters, working class voters who just don't see themselves represented or frankly even treated with sort of respect by the party apparatus. And so that is one of my real fears, is that sort of nihilism and cynicism will set in. So you're checking me, reminding me that optimism is really the only option.
Oh, that's a legitimate fear and concern. And if someone says like, hey, these institutions are morally bankrupt and don't care about me, I would say like, I completely understand why you feel that way. You might not even be entirely wrong.
Right, but you can change it. That's it. That's the thing is I actually agree. I think they are morally bankrupt. I don't think that they really care about you because from the beginning of this crisis, I mean, again, it's never been more clear. Who did Trump bring in to talk to? All the corporate CEOs and the banks. Who did, Richie Neal, who's, the head of an influential committee here on the Hill, who did he want to call up? Like Hank Paulson and Bob Rubin. I mean, it's just like the same cast of characters. And they're clearly the ones who got their giveaways and got Boeing got their own piece of legislation handcrafted for them. Even in the small business bailout, right? The bigger guys get the concierge service. Like, it is morally bankrupt, in my view. That's not like I
don't think
it's
it's up for question, personally.
But that doesn't mean it can't change. And I think
Yes.
that's the piece that you have to remain optimistic about. And you have to recognize that, that struggle doesn't happen like that. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not easy. There are forces that are arrayed that like the status quo, that benefit from the status quo. And so you can't get discouraged just because it doesn't happen for you this time or because the system doesn't all change at once. It takes a sustained struggle is basically the path that you have to choose.
I'm concerned about the negativity as well because I get it. It's like it's rational, just like it would be entirely rational for someone to check out on politics because it seems exhausting and mind-numbing and so negative. And they'd be like, my life is better if I'm just watching Tiger King or something more diverting. And I endorse Tiger King as a fine way to spend.
I'm like the only person in America who has not watched
hilarious.
Tiger King.
Yeah, it's actually a well done documentary. Anyway, anyone who decides to check out, it's like I'm sympathetic, but we don't have a choice. Like we have to engage with the systems, with politics, and try and right the ship. And there's no other way. It's why I ran a nonprofit for better part of 7 years. And I concluded I cannot solve the problem unless I rewrite the rules of the economy from the top down. And there was only one way to realistically do that. It was run for president and win. Said, okay, let me try that. And while we did not win, I did feel like we made massive progress towards trying to implement a different vision. And I'm committed to that. I understand why people have given up, but we can't give up. I mean, there's just no choice. And one thing I admire a lot of things about you, Krystal, but you're also like this super mom. You've got 3 kids. When you talk about being in DC in that town, I get the sense you wake up at the crack of dawn or even before dawn. You do these shows and the rest of it. And then you're transporting yourself to a totally different environment and then becoming supermom. At least this is what I'm imagining. And so you're a parent like I am. It's we can't give up because, our kids need us to win.
That's it. That's it exactly. And also, and not just our kids. Look, our kids, let's be real, have a lot of advantages and are incredibly lucky and privileged within this system and society. But do I want them to grow up in the kind of brutal place that would pick certain people deserve to have it all and other people deserve to basically deliver their sushi at 2 a.m. for scraps and not have health insurance? No, I don't think that's good for anyone. I don't think it's obviously not good for the people who are, on the front lines, making low wages, struggling every day. It's obviously bad for them. But I think it's just corrosive to the soul of the country. I think it's corrosive and destructive to everyone that is involved with that.
I couldn't agree more. I will say that I look at my boys all the time and I reflect on how differently they're growing up than how I grew up. And one of my boys is autistic, but neither of them is particularly rugged. I'll tell you that. I look at them and I'm just these kids are so... lucky would be the euphemism, I guess, where, it's just a lot of things are going on. But I agree with you that that even the winners lose in this winner take all system. And you're seeing it too. If you were to just be driven by mental health indicators, you go to even elite college campuses, the kids are fucking miserable. You know, these are like the offspring of the people that like scratched and clawed their way to the top. And then what was the point? You know, like that there's this inhumanity that punishes us all. And certainly it punishes the people who are left in material deprivation and early deaths and poverty first and most immediately. But it is corruptive for everyone. And there are all of these material incentives right now that distort our behaviors in ways that make us just worse people. There are a lot of folks that, you know, and you climb to the top of one of these hierarchies, and then you've sacrificed so much for all of this wealth, and then you're like, all right, I guess it must have been for the money. So this money must be the end all be all. You know, that's why I became an asshole over the last like number of years.
That's exactly right. And we have to have, and I don't know if you're a fan of the economist Thomas Piketty, who's done, you know, seminal works along with his colleagues on inequality, and he has a new book out that it's very long, but I'm working on it. But one of the things that he lays out is how throughout human history, societies have always had to construct narratives and mythology around why some people deserve this much and other people deserve the scraps. And we tend to think that our mythology is like better than, you know, if you're talking about like feudal or kings and queens and all of that.
You mean our meritocracy mythology?
Exactly. I mean, we have to recognize we have our own mythology. And what it says is like, oh, if you are that person that scratches and claws your way like an asshole to the top and like crushes everyone, that you deserve those billions of dollars, billions upon billions that you could never even spend in your entire lifetime. While
I worked
these
hard
other
for that
people,
money, Krystal. I worked hard for that money.
And you deserve it, Andrew. You deserve it all. But these other people who, you know, are struggling and scraping and who are lower income, who are working class, whose, you know, daily life is just very difficult just to make it all work, that's what they deserve. And so if that is the mythology at the core of your country, like, of course, that leads to treating some people like they are modern day lords and ladies who deserve to have not only that money and what comes with that, but to be the people who hold power, who make all the important decisions, right? And to be sort of treated as these demigods. And then at the other end of the spectrum, because you are not worthy of those things, you deserve to be treated less than human. And so I think that core mythology is part of what you have really effectively struck a blow against. And that's why, you know, I always tried to lift up your campaign and what you were doing, because I think that core message is so fundamentally important. It is so radical to say, like, every human being is worthy and deserves dignity and deserves to be treated fundamentally as a human being, as a human.
I can guarantee that just about everyone at that Purdue processing plant works a fuck of a lot harder than I do every single day. You know what I mean?
100%. Yes, absolutely.
And hopefully that becomes apparent to more people. I certainly felt like the meritocracy bullshit really was like this sinister way to convince people. It's like, well, if you won, it's because you worked so hard and you know, you were so talented, and that if someone's losing, well, they must deserve it somehow. And I just knew how ridiculous that was on its face. Maybe in part because I grew up the child of immigrants, and my first real job after I graduated from law school was set to pay, or did, I mean, I worked there, paid me more than my father was making. And my father had 69 patents and a PhD in physics. And I was like, on what world does my stupid corporate lawyering, like looking at this document for errors, like, in what world is that more valuable than my father literally inventing shit? Like, that makes zero sense. And so to me, like, the ridiculousness of it became apparent kind of early on. But it's that mythology that keeps so much of our people in line.
Yeah. No, I mean, so many. There's another great book, Utopia for Realists. I wish I could remember the author's name.
Rutger Bregman. He's a friend.
Yes.
He's a
no
really
kidding.
guy, yeah.
Yeah, so he talks about like bullshit jobs and how so many of the jobs in our country and a lot of developed countries are basically bullshit. Like if they went away, no one would really notice. And these tend to be like the more highly paid white collar professions. He gives this example of
Krystal, you mean if those management consultants like disappeared, then we'd all be like what happened?
we would all miss them immediately. All the CPAs like me, right? Or all the YouTubers like me. But he gives this great example of in Ireland, there was like this banking shutdown. And of course, in advance, it was like, oh my God, what are we going to do? It's going to be a disaster. We can't lose the bankers. And then it was like, no big deal. People just figured it out. They actually used their local pubs as like a sort of ad hoc way of lending money. And it was all totally fine and no one really missed a beat. So even at that level, it was like so many of these jobs are just sort of puffed up bullshit, moving money around or moving paperwork around, or I don't know. I remember what you said, checking the errors in like a legal briefing or whatever. So much of it is that. And meanwhile, the people who work the hardest, who actually make the country run on a daily basis, are the people who are treated the shabbiest in their work, in their lives by our society. And I think that that's a crime.
Yeah, I agree. We have to try and restore the dignity of each person. And certainly my seemingly radical give everyone money like just struck some people as ridiculous on its face, because it's like, oh, like how can that be? But we convinced millions of Americans. This crisis is convincing another millions of Americans, and I'm optimistic that we're going to actually be able to humanize this economy in the days to come, in part because we just don't have a choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm going to share in some of your optimism. I always
I'm so glad, Krystal. If I helped make you more optimistic, then that's like my accomplishment of the day. And then you're going to spread the optimism to millions, and then we will take over, the government.
Yeah. I just want people to know that they have power. I mean, that's the thing really, is I want people to know that they are not powerless observers, that they actually have agency and power in this system. And that may be, you talked about one of the biggest lies. That may be one of the biggest lies that's fed to people, is that they can't do anything, that they're hopeless, that they have to leave it to the people here. No, you have power and agency. You just have to take it.
Well, you're living proof of that, Krystal. You were a 27-year-old woman who just ran for Congress, not having any business doing so. And now you're a voice of reason and progress to millions, and an awesome role model. And I'm really glad to consider you a friend.
Well, same here, Andrew. I really admire what you've done, and I cannot wait to see what comes next also.
Krystal, you working on anything you want to share?
Well, the big thing is we would love for people to check out Rising on YouTube. Just go to the Hills YouTube channel and hit subscribe, smash subscribe, click the bell, all that good stuff. We love having our viewers engage, and just really appreciate those people who have said that the show have been meaningful to them.
And check out Krystal and Sagar's book, The Populist Guide to 2020, a series of essays about the race. I show up in some of them, but there's a lot of wisdom in this book. I learned a lot by reading it. All the best to you and the family. Be safe out there. And thank you so much. Say hey to John for me as well.
I will do that. Same to you and yours.